The Ascian question. Ever since the finale of the Hydaelyn and Zodiac arc with 6.0 Endwalker for Final Fantasy XIV, there's been this looming question when it comes to the story of Final Fantasy XIV. What to do with the other Ascians, cause there's still a few out there. But with the story of the Ancients and like Emmett Selk and Hythlodaeus so fully explored with Shadowbringers and Endwalker, a lot of people want a bit of a break from what the Ascians are just as an archetype of villain, to allow new and fresh ideas to come into the picture, and to let the story no longer feel as if it's all just Ascians. But is that the right call? Hello everybody, I am Jmulls of Jmulls Gaming. And whether or not there's been an Ascian in the background of Dawntrail has been a question since 7.0, but it's really picked up with 7.2. After the Zelania fight in 7.2, Calyx deliberately calls out the fact that he knows about reflections, the source, and all of that stuff.
We could give this chance to evolve not only to the people of the Ninth, but to those of the Source as well. I see no reason why you should reject such a boon.
Oh, don't tell me you thought you were the only ones who knew. That is the height of hubris.
And while there could possibly be other explanations for how he knows this information, the likely answer is that at some point in time an Ascian whispered into his ear. And with 7.3 being the big climactic finale for the Dawntrail story, at least it's seeming that way, the question remains, will we actually see an Ascian, and what will this all amount to? Because they wouldn't have included this part of the story if it wasn't important for some reason. Personally, I do think an Ascian is involved, but maybe not in the way you may think. There are some theories out there that this endless Calyx could be an Ascian in disguise or something like that, and like, yeah, sure, I think it's technically possible. I just don't know if I buy that they would pull the Ascian trigger in such a front and center position like Calyx so quickly after Endwalker. But with us so quickly addressing another shard with the Ninth, I think it only makes sense that we deal in some way, shape, or form with an Ascian or the consequences of an Ascian. You see, I don't think the Endless Calyx is an Ascian, personally. But I do think one whispered into his ear at some point in the past. I think the interesting question here is whether or not, like, Preservation and Calyx actually allied themselves up alongside the Ascian. Because remember, the Ascians wanted to rejoin all the shards to the source. That would have required the destruction of the Ninth. And for an organization called Preservation, I highly doubt they would have been okay with that goal. I think what they could be framing here, or even potentially setting up, is that Preservation knew of the Ascians' plan to rejoin the Ninth with the source, and they had some way, possibly Calyx did back in the day, they had some way to counteract that to keep the Ninth, while still severely damaged, still there. I don't think we will probably see an Ascian just come out into the middle of the camera and say, hey guys, I'm here. I don't really see that being the direction they take this story with Dawntrail for 7.3, but I think there's interesting stories to tell, especially if this next narrative arc, which in my opinion is likely to be a shard-hopping arc where we just go to a bunch of different shards, maybe not all at once, but at some point, or at least we deal with them. We have to deal with the consequences of leftover machinations of the Ascians. Because you have to imagine they were at least trying, at some point in the past, to have some kind of strategy or plan to rejoin each of the shards to the source. I highly doubt they just went like one by one. Some plans probably took longer than others, and potentially the Lightning Cataclysm is the result of an Ascian trying to rejoin that shard with the source, or, I mean, who knows? I think the really interesting way to frame this is that Preservation acted with the Endless and all this in such a way to counteract whatever the Ascians were actually doing, hence why the Ninth wasn't rejoined to the source, but still frame them in an antagonistic way. So it's like we don't want either side here to win out, it's just like two groups of bad guys duking it out, both for their own like selfish reasons of preservation. The Ascians wanted to save their people and rejoin all the shards, while the people of the Ninth and Preservation wanted to preserve their people. I think it's an interesting way to frame this whole situation, where you still make use of the Ascian stuff, which is an intrinsic element of the lore for Final Fantasy XIV, but if it's framed in such a way, I don't think it's like so in your face, especially after being like inundated with Ascian stuff in Shadowbringers and Endwalker. I wouldn't be surprised if, like, this is the direction they take with this story. I mean, I guess it's also possible that Preservation, for whatever reason, were working alongside the Ascians, and maybe perhaps they viewed a rejoining to be, like, a way to preserve their people, and for Calyx's case, a way to evolve their people into something greater. I think there's, like, possible motivations for, like, either path here, which leaves this story in its current state in such an interesting location, because it could go down a multitude of paths, and there's, like, little reasons to support each of them, and they could all produce, like, interesting outcomes. Or at least these two main paths I'm talking about, where it's like Calyx and Preservation were working alongside an Ascian in the past to help rejoin the Ninth with the Source for whatever reason. Probably using, like, Endless as a way to do that. Somehow that would be revealed if they do go down this path. Or Calyx and Preservation were acting in a way against the Ascian's interest to preserve the Ninth itself, and the Endless was their solution to this. It's a way to still have the story feel connected to everything that's led up to this current moment in time with the Highland and Zodiac arc, while still making it feel fresh and new, and it's really interesting to think about in my opinion. Because if this is the path they go down, it leads to so many, like, potentially interesting stories for the other shards we still have not gone to or explored at all. Because what could they be dealing with in terms of, like, what machinations did the Ascians try and impart on these other worlds? How could they possibly have been morphed? What kind of potential cataclysms could they be going under? Maybe there's still plans in motion. Or how did these worlds overcome those plans and those machinations? It's a way to keep the Ascian story going and to keep that stuff important, but not, like, shove an Ascian down our throat in, like, a big named role with each new location and each new expansion. We're still dealing with the potential fallout of all of that. And there's a way to even potentially frame it in such a way for, like, Asem's storyline. Because I agree with the theory that I think this big new narrative arc is going to be Asem focused, and will at some point in the future have us going to a bunch of different shards. Whether they want to do that all in one expansion, just have, like, each shard be a different zone, or we go to different shards as expansions, who knows? Or, like, some combination of the two, who knows? I think the motivations there and the potential lore ramifications are, like, vague enough to where the story can be super malleable going into the future to fit whatever they want to do with that expansion, while also still providing enough structure to keep it all feeling, like, interconnected. I get the story for Final Fantasy XIV was in a really rough spot there for a bit with 7.0 and 7.1, and the stories in those two versions of Final Fantasy XIV not being received universally well. I myself had a laundry list of issues with the way the story was told and what they were telling in those two versions of the game myself. And I've covered that extensively on the channel before. But I think, especially with 7.2 and where this story is likely to go with 7.3, I think they've put the story in such a position to where now with Preservation, with Calyx, with Fiend, with the Nine, this is an interesting, like, starting position for a new narrative arc. Did we get to this position in the most optimal and enjoyable way imaginable? Probably not. But we're here now. It may have taken a minute, may have taken a few twists and turns, bumps and bruises, but we are here now. And just from my own anecdotal experience and my own opinions about 7.2, opinions on the story seem to have changed for the better, quickly as well. I think it goes to show just how much of a better story 7.2 was, in a lot of ways. I'm also a bit of an advocate on a simple writing idea. I don't really believe in bad stories, I believe in bad storytelling. Now, that does sound like a blanket statement, and I'm sure there are some exceptions to the rule, and I don't want to, like, bog down in, like, addressing specific examples of, like, things that may counteract that idea. The main takeaway and what I really mean from this is that there's a lot of stories and overall, like, plot beats that I think could work so long as you develop it well and in an interesting way with good pacing, good characterization, and just overall good presentation and packaging. It's one of the reasons I'm optimistic for the future of Final Fantasy XIV's story at this current moment in time, because with 7.2, they showed me a style of writing a story, also in terms of characterization and pacing and that overall presentation, I hadn't gotten out of the game since the end of 6.0. Now, granted, there are elements of the story that I liked since. I am still a fan of the Endwalker patches. They aren't perfect, but overall I am still a fan of them. I just think 7.2 is like the best story we've gotten in this game since 6.0. Still has a few issues that need to be ironed out, a few slow points that could maybe use some like touching up, but in terms of where this story could go, I'm kind of down for whatever at this point in time. Because the more important element to me is the way that it's told. And so long as you give it enough development and you relay the information in a cohesive, understandable, and also enjoyable way, I think like any of these different routes this story could take that I've discussed in this video could potentially be really great, so long as they're developed in an interesting way, including if you want to put an Ascian front and center in the story at some point in time, even if it's 7.3. It's like, yeah, I understand that a lot of people have Ascian fatigue because they were such an intrinsic and important element of the story for so long, right? I get that. Especially with Endwalker, and some people will want a bit of a break. But if the character itself is really good and compelling and makes sense in the story, then I don't see the issue. I think especially after 7.0 and 7.1, and while those stories have their own fans, and I'm not trying to detract from those people's enjoyment of the story, right? There's a lot of people that were disappointed with those stories. So I think there's a lot of people out there that don't care so much about Ascian fatigue, they just want a really compelling and interesting story. I think Final Fantasy XIV also has one of the best Chekhov's guns in the game right now, and that is the key to interdimensional travel. The chalice thing, right, with the Asen logo from the Sphene fight, and why I call it one of the best Chekhov's guns in this game is because as a device itself, it is mysterious and interesting enough to act as good motivation for right now with the story of Calyx and Preservation, because we don't want them to go to different shards and like Walk 9000 all those shards for ether, right? It makes sense. It's a nice little plot device for that reason. We want to protect the key, sure, whatever. But also in terms of its future potential, it opens up a whole host of potential storylines because we largely don't know anything about it. And like, yeah, could it be poorly used in the future and just an excuse to do whatever? Absolutely. But it comes down to the way you tell this story, in my opinion, what I was just talking about. Because there's also ways to tell a story using this item in interesting and fun ways that open up the potential types of stories that could be told with these other shards going into the future. I think especially if the story is going to go in the direction of us interacting with other shards in some way, shape, or form, like we're doing currently with the 9th, then it makes sense that we have to deal with some Ascian stuff, because it's not like they just probably ignored certain shards, right? They probably have plans at some point in the past for each of those shards, and maybe they went through with a few of them, maybe a few of them failed, but like dealing with the ramifications of those plans could be really interesting and a way to ground this strange new world we could potentially be going to or interacting with, and ground those stories with something that is familiar to us, with the Ascians. I've talked about since 7.2 how I think they're kind of gearing us up to have a new party. And I think the party is going to be composed of like characters representing each of the different worlds. So we are the Source, and like maybe Graha, but I'm not entirely sure how important he's going to be in the future. Reen and Gaia from the 1st, Zero and Golbez from the 13th, and I think they're gearing up Sphene, like our Sphene from 7.2, to be a main traveling companion for us, and I think she'll represent the 9th. And I could see along the way in this new story arc, as we're dealing with new worlds, we pick up a new companion from each of those worlds for some big climactic finale involving like all these characters in a new group of misfits, right? Because I think for a new narrative arc, we need a new batch of characters to fall in love with and to care for, but also to be alongside us. You can't just continually reuse characters whose story arcs are largely concluded at this point in time, unless they're going to go on a new character arc, and I just don't really see that for anyone outside of like maybe Y'shtola. I think the play is to utilize these like other world characters. Reed and Gaia got development back in Shadowbringers, so these are known characters, they are beloved characters, but they could still have interesting stories to tell. Same with Zero and Golbez. We developed all these characters, we developed those characters specifically in the Endwalker patches, including the 13th, They clearly want us to go back there at some point in time in the future, but we just kind of like left them and went on to Dawntrail. I've always been of the opinion that's because they wanted to get the development for those characters done and out the way, so when they bring them back into the story at some point in the future, we can just have payoff with them, and we don't have to tell that story then. We've already done it. And we're doing the same thing with Sphene right now. It's like, I don't see them bringing back Sphene, the original Queen Sphene, just to have her die in 7.3. I don't see that happening. It makes sense to me if you bring her back to capitalize on the story beats of Dawntrail, especially with 7.2, to bring it into the future, because this all feels like setup to me, in terms of like building a new crew. And whether or not that's so we can be opposed against a certain Ascian, or we're just dealing with the ramifications of what the Ascians were already doing, who knows? It's entirely possible that Preservation or some member of Preservation, even Calyx himself, could be the big bad for this new narrative arc, or one of the big bads, because it's not like the Highland Zodiac arc only had Medion. Right? There are Ascians, Golemald, etc. But I think this is the way to do the Ascians. I don't think it's the only way, but I think this is one of the ways you could do the Ascians to keep them relevant, to enact interesting things on these various worlds, but not feel as if Ascians are being forced down our throats. Pause. This is the power of a really good patch, in my opinion. The power to introduce and develop interesting characters, motivations, and just completely change a lot of people's perspective on what could happen in the future, and also draw in a lot more interest in what could happen. I don't think the Ascians are characters or even an archetype of character that should be shunned and completely like thrown away like yesterday's trash or anything like that. I think there are ways to utilize Ascians in interesting ways for the future of the story, but I think the emphasis and the focus should be on new stuff instead of just being like, the big bad, you'll never believe it, it's another Ascian, he wants to rejoin all the shots. We've had that story before. But there's ways to take that development and frame it in interesting ways for new and entertaining stories. I think that is the direction to go for. And with that, I'll call the video there for the day. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure for making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It'd really help the channel out and help support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Leave a comment down below with your own wild, wacky theories for Final Fantasy XIV. I want your wildest, I want your wackiest, and I may even react to them in a future video. I'd love to hear your thoughts, hear your opinions, and hear your perspectives. Stay safe, have a great day, leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody, until we meet again!